The door creaked open, revealing Jake, my son-in-law, standing there with the kind of nonchalant ease that could disarm even the most guarded person. The late afternoon sun framed him perfectly, his broad shoulders cutting a striking silhouette. He wasn't dressed for gardening, dark jeans that clung just right, a fitted t-shirt, and a charming smirk that bordered on mischievous. He held a pair of work gloves loosely in one hand, the other resting on the doorframe as though he had all the time in the world. "I thought I'd stop by and help with the garden," he said, his voice casual but warm, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. It was such a simple statement, but something in the way he said it lingered, an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. His eyes, a shade of blue that seemed to shift with the light, met mine with an unspoken familiarity. They lingered just a second longer than necessary. For a moment, I forgot how to respond, the words catching somewhere in my throat. Jake was the kind of man who moved through the world with an effortless confidence, a quality that seemed to make everything around him pause and take notice. He had a quiet magnetism, nothing overt, nothing you could easily point to, but it pulled you in all the same. It wasn't just his looks, though those were impossible to ignore. The strong jawline, the hint of scruff, and that half smile that always seemed to be playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the way he carried himself, a kind of unshakable self-assurance that made you wonder what it would feel like to step into his orbit. "Sure," I finally said, stepping aside to let him in, though my heart was pounding in a way that felt ridiculous. He brushed past me, and for a fleeting moment, the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy with a hint of spice, lingered in the air between us. It was nothing, I told myself. A simple visit, an offer to help, nothing more. But as I watched him move toward the garden with a practiced ease, a thought I couldn't quite suppress crept into the corners of my mind. When had Jake started becoming more than just my son-in-law? It was one of those sunny, late summer afternoons when the air seemed to buzz with quiet contentment. The family had gathered in the backyard, the scent of grilled meat wafting from the barbecue, mingling with the sweetness of blooming jasmine. Laughter bubbled around the patio as glasses clinked and conversation flowed, but my attention kept drifting, almost involuntarily, toward Jake. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just standing by the grill, laughing at something my husband had said, but there was an ease to him that seemed to set him apart from everyone else. He wore a light blue button-up rolled at the sleeves, the color making his eyes look even brighter. His hair caught the sunlight, strands of gold and brown shimmering as he tilted his head back to laugh. It was such a mundane scene, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he listened when people spoke, his focus undivided, that made it impossible to ignore him. When he turned toward me, our eyes met across the crowd. It lasted only a second, maybe two, but in that brief moment, it felt as if the world had gone quiet. Jake smiled at me then, a warm, unguarded smile that felt like it was meant just for me. I quickly looked away, suddenly hyper-aware of the heat rising to my cheeks. I busied myself arranging the table, but my hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm facade I tried to maintain. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I found myself sitting alone on the swing chair at the edge of the yard. The rhythmic creak of the chains was almost soothing as I gazed out at the garden, trying to process the strange undercurrent of the day. I didn't hear Jake approach until he was already there, a glass of wine in each hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Of course," I said, my voice steady, though my heart betrayed me, pounding erratically in my chest. He handed me a glass, then sat beside me, the swing chair dipping slightly under his weight. For a while, we just sat there, the conversation light and easy. He asked me about the flowers I had planted, complimenting the vibrant colors, and shared a story about how his grandmother had a garden full of roses when he was a boy. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the words, but it was the way he spoke, his tone sincere, his eyes meeting mine as though he truly cared about my answers. And then it happened, a fleeting touch. He reached across to pluck a stray leaf from my shoulder, his fingertips brushing against my skin. It was so quick, so seemingly innocent, but it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. As the night wore on and the stars began to dot the sky, Jake eventually stood to leave, his hand lingering on the back of the swing chair for just a moment. "You should spend more time out here," he said softly, his voice almost wistful. "It suits you." And just like that, he was gone, swallowed up by the glow of the patio lights and the hum of family chatter. I sat there for a long time after, staring at the empty glass in my hand and wondering why such an ordinary evening suddenly felt so extraordinary. The house always felt emptier when my husband was away. The silence stretched through the rooms, wrapping itself around me like an unwelcome companion. At first, I busied myself with small tasks, organizing shelves, tending to the garden, catching up on books I'd long meant to read. But there was no denying the way the absence left a void that grew heavier with each passing day. It was during one of these lonely stretches that Jake began stopping by more often. At first, his visits seemed incidental, a quick drop-off of something for my daughter, or a casual check-in about the house repairs he'd helped with a few months prior. But over time, his presence became more frequent, and something about the way he lingered hinted at more than just familial duty. One afternoon, I was pruning roses in the front garden when I heard the familiar hum of Jake's car pulling into the driveway. He stepped out with that same easy confidence, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand and a six-pack of craft beer in the other. "I thought you might need some company," he said with a smile that felt both innocent and disarming. "And maybe a break from all this yard work." It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. I wiped the dirt from my hands, suddenly self-conscious about my appearance. A smudge of soil on my cheek, hair tied back messily. But Jake didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. Inside, we unpacked the groceries together, his casual banter filling the empty space of the kitchen. He told me about a new project at work, his voice lighting up with excitement as he explained the details. There was something about the way he spoke, his ambition, his passion, that caught me off guard. I'd always thought of Jake as steady, reliable, but here was a side of him I hadn't seen before. Dynamic, driven, utterly captivating. As he reached for a glass in the cabinet above me, his arm brushed against mine. It was such a slight touch, but it sent an unexpected spark through me. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, but Jake glanced down, his expression unreadable, before stepping back with a polite, "Sorry about that." That evening, after he'd left, I sat alone on the couch, sipping one of the beers he'd brought and replaying the day in my mind. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about his visit, nothing anyone else would have found unusual, but it felt different. He felt different. The way he lingered, the way his gaze met mine and held for just a fraction too long, it was as though he saw me, not as a wife or a mother or a figure on the periphery, but as a person. With each of my husband's trips, Jake's visits continued. He'd come by to help with odd jobs or simply to check in, as he'd say. Sometimes we'd share a coffee in the garden or a glass of wine in the living room, the conversation weaving between lighthearted anecdotes and surprisingly personal confessions. And yet, beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent, a tension I couldn't quite name, or perhaps one I wasn't ready to admit to myself. Every laugh lingered a moment too long. Every glance carried an unspoken weight. The void my husband's absence created was slowly being filled, but with it came a growing awareness that I was treading on dangerous ground. The changes were subtle at first. Jake's visits felt longer, his reasons for stopping by becoming less defined. He no longer came with groceries or excuses to fix something around the house. Instead, he dropped by unannounced, leaning casually against the kitchen counter as if he belonged there, his presence weaving itself into the fabric of my day in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our conversations began to shift too. What once stayed firmly in the realm of family updates or harmless small talk had started to wander into deeper, uncharted territories. He'd ask me questions that caught me off guard, questions that felt unusually perceptive. "What do you do when you're not taking care of everyone else?" he asked one afternoon, his tone sincere. I remember faltering, fumbling for an answer that wouldn't betray how much his words had unsettled me. I hadn't thought about that in years. It was such an innocent question, but in that moment, it felt like a challenge, a spotlight on a part of myself I'd nearly forgotten existed. Jake had a way of steering the conversation in directions that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, but strangely seen. He talked about his own dreams and regrets with a candor that was both disarming and magnetic. One evening, as the light outside turned golden and shadows stretched across the room, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something quieter, more intimate. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, almost to himself, "if we spend too much time doing what's expected instead of what we actually want." The statement lingered in the air between us, heavy with implication. I tried to brush it off, laughing lightly. "That's a dangerous way to think." "Maybe," he replied, his eyes catching mine and holding them. "But isn't it also the most honest way to live?" The tension in the room was palpable, the unspoken meaning behind his words pressing against the walls. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and something I couldn't name coursing through me. His gaze dropped briefly to my hands, which were fidgeting with the hem of my shirt. I forced them still, folding them neatly in my lap, but it was too late. He'd noticed. Over time, these moments became more frequent, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. A brush of his hand as he passed me a cup of coffee, the way his eyes seemed to linger on mine when he spoke, even the subtle shifts in his voice when he asked me questions that felt far too personal. Every interaction felt like a step closer to some unspoken line neither of us dared to acknowledge outright. And yet, despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, I found myself craving these moments. The conversations, the glances, the quiet moments that seemed to stretch longer than they should, they were intoxicating. They reminded me of something I thought I'd lost, something that had been buried under years of routine and responsibility. But with that realization came an undeniable sense of guilt. This was wrong. It was dangerous. It was selfish. I told myself that I should put an end to it, that I should set boundaries before the line was crossed. And yet, every time Jake walked through the door with that easy smile, every time he leaned closer than necessary to show me something on his phone or brushed past me in the narrow hallway, I felt myself drawn to him all the same. It wasn't just his charm or his confidence, it was the way he made me feel seen, understood, alive. And that, I knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. It was a quiet evening when Jake's invitation came, unexpected and disarming. He had arrived at the house just as the sky turned a dusky shade of lavender, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had fallen earlier in the day. I had been folding laundry in the living room, the rhythm of the task soothing in its monotony, when he appeared in the doorway, a bottle of wine in hand and an expression that seemed almost tentative. "Thought you might like some company," he said, holding up the bottle with a small, almost sheepish smile. "And maybe a glass of this." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the towel I was folding. There was nothing overtly improper about the offer. It was just a drink, just conversation. And yet, the way he stood there, his eyes meeting mine with that familiar intensity, made the air feel charged with something unspoken. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. Jake's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't step back. Instead, he moved closer, setting the bottle on the coffee table as he sat down across from me. "It's just a drink," he said softly. "No expectations, no pressure. I just thought." He trailed off, his gaze dropping briefly to the folded laundry before returning to me. "I thought you could use a break." It was such a simple statement, but it hit me harder than I expected. When was the last time someone had thought about what I needed? The thought lingered, heavy and unsettling, as I sat there, torn between the weight of what was right and the pull of what I wanted. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until I finally sighed and reached for the bottle. "Just one glass," I said, my tone firmer than I felt. Jake's smile returned, softer this time, and he uncorked the bottle with practiced ease. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to me before leaning back against the couch, his posture relaxed, but his eyes still fixed on me. As we sipped the wine, the conversation began in safe territory. Family updates, work stories, the weather. But as the minutes passed, the topics grew more personal. Jake talked about his frustrations at work, his desire to do something that felt meaningful. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing things I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "I don't know," I said at one point, swirling the wine in my glass. Sometimes I feel like I've lost something, like there's a part of me I can't quite reach anymore. Jake's gaze softened, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. Maybe it's not lost, he said gently. Maybe you've just forgotten where to look. The words hung in the air between us, their weight undeniable. I looked away, suddenly unable to hold his gaze, and stared down at the deep red liquid in my glass. You make it sound so simple. It can be, he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. The room felt smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. I set my glass down on the table, my heart pounding in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I think I should, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Jake didn't move closer, didn't reach for me. He just sat there, watching me with an expression that was equal parts understanding and patience. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, he said softly. And yet, even as he spoke the words, the pull between us was undeniable, a current I couldn't ignore. The glass of wine, the quiet conversation, the lingering tension, it was all a prelude to something I wasn't sure I could walk away from. When I finally met his gaze again, something shifted. It wasn't a decision, not really. It was a surrender, an acceptance of what had already begun. One more glass, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled, reaching for the bottle. The wine poured smoothly into my glass, a quiet promise of what was to come. The visits became a rhythm, a pattern I couldn't help but anticipate. Jake would arrive unannounced, his familiar knock on the door sending a jolt through me, equal parts excitement and dread. At first, it was easy to dismiss his presence as casual, a simple extension of family bonds. But with each visit, the boundaries blurred a little more, the lines we shouldn't cross becoming harder to see. It was in the small, ordinary moments that the changes became undeniable. One afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, Jake leaned against the counter beside me, watching with a half smile that made my chest tighten. You're good at that, he said, his voice warm. I laughed, brushing off the compliment. It's just cooking. No, he said, his gaze steady. It's the way you do it, like it's an art form. The words were simple, almost innocent, but the way he said them made the air feel heavier. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the aroma of garlic and onions. When he reached over to adjust the cutting board, his hand brushed mine, lingering just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. The moments piled up like this, little touches that seemed incidental but carried an undeniable weight. A hand on my back as he reached past me for a glass, fingers grazing my wrist as he handed me a plate, his leg brushing mine under the table as we sat talking late into the evening. Each one felt like a spark, a reminder of the unspoken connection growing between us. The conversations, too, became more intimate, slipping into territory that felt far too personal. One evening, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, the light painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Jake leaned back in his chair, a beer in hand, and asked, if you could do anything at all, what would it be? The question caught me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to answer. I don't know, I said finally. I guess I haven't thought about it in a long time. You should, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You deserve to have something that's just yours. It was a simple statement, but it stayed with me long after he'd gone. He had a way of saying things that felt like a spotlight, illuminating parts of myself I'd buried long ago. As the weeks went by, the encounters grew more charged. Jake's compliments became more frequent, his glances lingering just a little too long. I found myself looking forward to his visits in a way I couldn't explain. My heart racing whenever I heard his car pull into the driveway. And yet, with each passing moment, the tension grew sharper, the awareness of what we were doing pressing against me like a weight. I told myself it was harmless, just conversations, just touches, just the thrill of being seen in a way I hadn't been in years. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way my body leaned toward him without thinking, the way my laugh seemed louder when he was around, the way my pulse quickened whenever his hand brushed mine, it was undeniable. One evening, as he stood in the doorway saying goodbye, his hand lingered on the frame, his eyes searching mine. You're not alone, he said softly, his voice full of meaning. I know, I replied, my throat tight. But as I closed the door behind him, leaning against it with a trembling breath, I couldn't help but wonder if that was true. It wasn't just the frequency of Jake's visits that changed, it was the tone of them. The way our conversations drifted into territories that felt simultaneously exhilarating and dangerous. What began as lighthearted banter or polite inquiries about each other's days evolved into something richer, heavier, tinged with an intimacy that neither of us dared to fully acknowledge. Jake had a way of noticing things that others overlooked. One afternoon, as I absent-mindedly adjusted a framed photo on the mantle, he smiled softly. "You do that a lot," he said. "Do what?" I asked, glancing over at him. "Fidget with things. Like you're always trying to make everything perfect." The observation caught me off guard. I hadn't realized I did that, but his words hung in the air, settling into a space I hadn't opened for anyone in years. "Maybe I just like order," I said lightly, trying to brush it off. "Or maybe you're trying to keep yourself busy," he replied, his gaze steady, unyielding. The honesty of his words hit like a jolt, and I found myself looking away, unable to meet his eyes. Jake had a way of peeling back the layers, of seeing the parts of me I thought I'd hidden well. And it wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them. The quiet understanding in his voice that made me feel simultaneously exposed and understood. As the days turned into weeks, these moments became more frequent. He'd compliment me in ways that felt deeply personal, beyond the surface-level pleasantries I was used to. "You have a way of making people feel at ease," he said one evening as we sat in the living room, a glass of wine between us. "It's like you see people for who they are, not just what they show the world." I laughed nervously, trying to deflect the intensity of his words. "That's quite the compliment." "It's not a compliment," he said, his voice firm. "It's the truth." The weight of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the rim of my glass. But even as I tried to dismiss it, his words lingered, threading themselves into the fabric of my thoughts. Our interactions became a delicate dance, each moment steeped in unspoken tension. Casual touches grew more deliberate, a hand brushing against mine as he passed me a mug, his fingers grazing my shoulder as he leaned in to look at something I was reading. Each touch was fleeting, leaving behind a spark that seemed to linger long after the contact was gone. And then there were the silences. Those long, charged pauses where neither of us spoke, the weight of what was left unsaid filling the room like a tangible presence. It was in those silences that I felt the pull the strongest, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer even when we were sitting feet apart. But with every moment of intimacy came an equal measure of guilt. Late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I'd replay our conversations, our touches, the way his eyes lingered on mine. This was wrong. I was a wife, a mother, a woman bound by commitments and vows. And yet, Jake made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, something I wasn't sure I could walk away from. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me, his expression serious. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. The simplicity of the statement brought tears to my eyes, tears I quickly blinked away before he could see. "Happiness is complicated," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't have to be," he said, his hand reaching out to lightly touch mine. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I felt the warmth of his skin against mine. In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line. Perhaps not an obvious one, but a line nonetheless. And yet, as I looked at him, his gaze steady and unwavering, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The night it happened, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with a tension I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. Jake had come over after dinner, his knock on the door carrying its usual jolt, though this time it felt sharper, more insistent. I opened the door to find him standing there with his characteristic half-smile, hands shoved into his pockets. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes told a different story. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He moved past me, his presence filling the room in a way that felt both familiar and disconcerting. As he settled onto the couch, I joined him, sitting close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, but far enough to maintain the fragile boundary we'd managed to keep intact, until now. We talked for a while, the conversation winding through safe topics: work, family, the upcoming holidays. But there was an undercurrent to his words, a weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, his voice dipping into a register that sent a shiver through me. At some point, the conversation faltered, leaving a silence that was anything but empty. I felt his eyes on me, and when I turned to meet his gaze, the intensity there stole the breath from my lungs. He shifted slightly, leaning closer, his hand resting on the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the voice in my head, screaming at me to stop, to step back, to say something, anything, to break the moment. But I couldn't. The air between us crackled with something electric, something inevitable. "Jake?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. He leaned in, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to tell him to stop. But I didn't. I couldn't. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. When his lips finally met mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire that had been smoldering for far too long. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, testing the boundaries of what we both knew was forbidden. But it didn't stay that way. The intensity grew, the pressure of his lips against mine, deepening, as his hand moved to cup the side of my face, his thumb brushing my cheek in a way that sent a thrill through me. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing to just the two of us, the warmth of his body, the feel of his lips, the taste of him. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his shirt as though it were the only thing anchoring me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Jake pulled back, his breathing uneven, his forehead resting against mine. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I didn't mean. But he had meant it, and so had I. I sat there, stunned, my lips tingling, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Guilt and exhilaration warred within me, each emotion battling for dominance. This was wrong. It was reckless. It was everything I had sworn I would never allow myself to feel. And yet, as I looked at him, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination, I knew there was no going back. The line we had crossed couldn't be uncrossed. The feelings we had unleashed couldn't be contained. "I should go," Jake said finally, his voice rough. But he didn't move. I nodded, my voice failing me as I tried to form words that would make this moment less real, less significant. "Maybe you should." But neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what we had done, of what it meant. When he finally stood, his movements slow and reluctant, I felt the loss of his presence like a physical ache. He hesitated in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as he turned back to look at me. "I don't regret it," he said softly, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with the echoes of his words and the memory of his kiss. The kiss lingered like an unspoken promise, and the world seemed to shift on its axis after Jake left. I stood in the empty room, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. The memory of his lips against mine played on an endless loop in my mind, an intoxicating replay that left me breathless each time it resurfaced. But with each passing second, the weight of guilt grew heavier, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother me. I tried to shake it off, tried to dismiss it as a mistake, as something that could be swept under the rug and forgotten. But nothing was easy anymore. Every quiet moment, every silence between the ticking of the clock brought the memory of his touch rushing back, vivid and impossible to ignore. I sat in the chair where he'd left me, my body still humming with the sensation of his kiss, but my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had left, but his presence had filled the room in a way that felt permanent, like he was still there, standing just out of reach. Part of me wanted to erase everything, to pretend it never happened and go back to the way things were. But another part, one I didn't fully understand, wanted more. The truth was, I had been drawn to Jake long before that kiss. The connection between us had been growing for weeks, a slow burn that had crept under my skin without me even realizing it. But that kiss, the way it felt, the way he made me feel, had shattered everything. The line I had carefully maintained, the barrier I had told myself would never be crossed, had been obliterated in a single, undeniable moment. But there was a deeper, darker truth I couldn't ignore. The guilt twisted in my gut, but beneath it, there was a thrilling exhilaration, a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. It was a dangerous feeling, something I had long since buried, but it was there, unmistakable and undeniable. Jake had awakened something in me that I thought was lost. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. My husband's absence was like a ghost in the room, a silent presence that I couldn't escape. The silence between us had stretched so far that I barely recognized it anymore. He was gone so often now, on business, traveling, doing whatever it was that kept him away from me and our family. Had this all been a result of that absence? Had I been searching for something I was no longer getting at home? The questions swirled around my mind, unanswered and endless. I had tried to convince myself that I didn't need anything beyond what I already had, that I was content with the life we had built. But now, in the aftermath of that kiss, I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though that had left me craving more. It was the emotional connection, the raw, unfiltered honesty in the way Jake had looked at me, the way he had seen me, truly seen me, in a way that no one else had in years. I was no longer just the wife or the mother, the woman who had become a routine, a set of responsibilities. With Jake, I was something else, something more, something dangerous. The guilt was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, but it was tempered by the exhilaration of what we had shared. I knew it wasn't just a one-time thing. There was something real between us, something undeniable. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the more it pulled me in. As I lay there in the darkness, my thoughts tangled with the shadows, I knew one thing for certain: things could never go back to the way they were. The door had been opened, and there was no closing it now.